Welcome to Dialogues with Masters, where we are fortunate enough to spend time with some of the most internally technologically advanced beings on the planet, who in addition to developing extraordinary skills, have also strived to develop a profound sense of wisdom and maturity. Because of this very important foundation being laid out, these brilliant beings use their abilities with utmost responsibility and reverence for the evolution of mankind. Today's guest is a wonderful example of this in action, so sit back, take it all in, feel free to ask any questions you may have in the comments section below, and enjoy. Welcome to Dialogues with Masters. Our guest today is a spiritual teacher and author of Reality Unbound, a new science exploration of psychic experiences and the conscious world in which we live. She holds a doctorate in philosophy and religion with a concentration in women's spirituality from the California Institute of Integral Studies, where she currently teaches. Renowned for her investigative research into psycho-spiritual experiences and their implications for understanding the nature of reality. Her driving passion is to help those who have had psychic spiritual experiences connect with the sacredness of the natural world, live in greater harmony, and share their wisdom with the wider community. Please join me in welcoming our wonderful guest, Lisa M. Christie. Lisa, thank you so much for coming on. How are you?
Thank you, Stu, for inviting me. I'm very good, thank you.
Wonderful, wonderful to know. So we ask all of our guests this one question, and always fascinates me. I would love to get your take on this, but what is consciousness to you?
That is the big question. I, like many people in the West, was brought up very specifically to think that consciousness is a process that takes place within the brain. And as I began to have my own psychic and spiritual experiences, it was clear that those experiences were happening beyond the brain. They were validated as being part of some objective reality. And so then one is left to try to figure out, well, what is the nature of this reality? So that became the topic of my doctoral dissertation. And my worldview evolved, from a very somewhat unexamined worldview that held kind of this idea of physicalism, of philosophical materialism, and that our psyche was in the brain, along with this, fairly large spectrum of different experiences that I'd had that I'd been able to validate. And in that process, my view evolved to consciousness as the foundation. Consciousness is the foundation of existence. And, obviously that's turning the philosophical materialism paradigm on its head altogether.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I find it so fascinating that you went from sort of the intuitive side of things and having these sorts of experiences into the academic world, in which you sort of created a framework for these experiences that you had and dove even deeper into it. So I'm curious, can you get into how you went from, this sort of curiosity and, or not just curiosity, but these experiences, of what these experiences were and how that led you through your journey into academia and beyond?
Yeah, that's a great question. As you said, I did begin with those experiences, but I was also brought up outside of any institutional religion. And so I was, from a very young age, trying to work out for myself what is the nature of reality. So I was already thinking philosophically, by 10, 11 years old. And, where are we located? Are we in our bodies? Are we a part of our bodies? And so those interests were always there. And so When I moved into my college years, I was very interested in philosophy and religion. They were core interests for me. And because I had no support in getting through college, I needed to take a bit of a detour. So I studied computer science, I studied business administration. Yeah, I did some of the practical things that we do in the world. And then I came back to philosophy and religion when I had a bit more leeway to do that. And so, you know, the experiences that I've had since I was a child, and that curiosity to understand better, were hand in hand. And I finally had the opportunity in my doctoral studies to give that full um, exploration.
And you've been looking into everything, very deeply ever since, it seems. Also, um, what were some of the experiences that you had that kind of initiated this curiosity?
Yes, thank you. When I was, again, 8, 9 years old, from time to time, I would experience discarnate presences that people often call ghosts. And, sometimes this experience was shared by someone else. For example, there was a man that was a shadow, appeared to me like a shadow that I saw walking through the house and up the stairs to the attic. And, fortunately, my sister was there too, and she saw the same thing at the same time. Interestingly enough, since we're so quick to discredit children, sadly, um, decades later, the current owner of the house tracked us down and asked if we had seen a man walking through the house because her daughter had seen him as well. So I think it started there and then moved into telepathy and dream telepathy, where I had a very dear friend who was unfortunately joined one of the cults that use mind control. And we had been in touch only through dreams, and she was forbidden to have access to the outside world. And one night I would dream about her. We were talking on the phone, and she would say, "No, I'm happy where I am," and but we were talking regularly. And one night I dreamt we were talking on the phone, and she said, "I'm home now." It was so vivid, so real, that I reached out and tried to call her family. And they had changed their number, but I very quickly got in touch with a relative who said her parents had just brought her home, and she was home, and we had the opportunity to speak one-on-one within days. Um, Also, something that I think that, in reflection affected me a great deal was my father was always psychic as well. And he had a enlightenment experience when I was growing up. And I was the person that he could talk to about it. So I kind of held him and worked with him throughout processing that whole experience. So I think that had a big impact on me. And then when I was a little bit older, sometimes the spirits would give me a message or speak to me, very rarely. And I started having out of body experiences. I had wanted to do that and had tried. And one day was lying down a little drifty, and I knew that I could do it. I think the mindset that I couldn't do it had loosened, and I projected my consciousness over 3,000 miles away, where I was a point in space, and that changed my worldview in a dramatic way because it was so vivid and it was so real. I had no doubt of what I was experiencing. And I knew I knew in that moment that the world was so much more than it may appear to be, not just to the given of our sensory experience, but also what we've been taught, which shapes how we experience the world. And that we were in touch. We are so close to, we can be in touch with anyone or anything kind of through this psychic dimension. It's like there can be this closeness and intimacy even when we're at, what we consider a physical distance from each other.
Beautiful.
Um, I have more to say if you have the time.
Absolutely. But before we move forward, I actually wanted to
Yeah,
touch on some of the incidences that you experienced,
yeah,
particularly your out of body experience or your projection experience. Can you
yes.
describe what that was like for you? And was that naturally or, I suppose, almost randomly occurring? Or did you consciously kind of create that experience for yourself at that moment?
I think that I had laid the groundwork for it through conscious attempts to leave my body. So, I would lie there and then I would intend, and my whole body would start to vibrate, but I didn't get past that place. So, this one time I was lying there and I was drifty, and it was like, here's your opportunity. I just knew it. And so I focused on where I wanted to go. And that was a park across the street from the house where I had grown up. That had a special meaning to me. And I focused on that place. It was a very unusual experience, even in relation to the out of body experiences I've had since, in that I felt like I was going through, I won't say it looked like a physical tunnel, but it was like a flower, like going inside of flower petals, and they kept opening up. And I felt I was traveling at a very high speed until I somewhat popped out as a point in space in this place. And it was so vivid. It was so much more real than ordinary waking experience was. And I saw a car parked along the street, and I thought, opportunity for evidence. So I was intending, I would move through intention, intending myself to the car, and I saw a newspaper folded in the passenger seat, and I got very excited. And when I got excited, I popped directly back into my body. So, that tells me, that there continues to be a connection to the physical body. And unfortunately, when the physical body feels like something's going on, it's going to want you back.
Yeah. And from my understanding, it's interesting that you said that. I believe it was Dr. Robert Gilbert said something along the lines of your ability to perceive the spiritual realm is dependent on your non-reaction to it.
Mhm.
And it almost seems like that's essentially what you were implying just there. But such a amazing experience, I'm sure. But do you remember if there were physical sensations also there? I mean, what sort of sensations were you experiencing? I know you mentioned you were able to see, so it was
Uh-huh.
clearly visual input. Was there any other sort of input that you were experiencing?
That's such a great question, because it is interesting that there is a visual like input. Um, and I've wondered about that. I know that there's a research study that was done in a book published, described in a book called Mindsight, where they showed that even people who had been blind, since birth, were able to, in out of body experiences or in clairvoyant experiences, perceive and something like sight, but it was kind of 360 degrees. So, there is some perception. And I sometimes suspect that it, we tend to take this and translate it through the visual centers of the brain, or learn to symbolize that way, learn to see that way. But it's such an interesting topic that we are able to see. And I didn't have any feeling sensations, bodily sensations at all. Um, and I didn't particularly notice sound. It was just such a strong sense of presence and clarity, and sight was definitely prominent.
Wow. Wow. Yeah, that is fascinating. And when the visual stimulus that you were receiving, was it as consistent as it is in your waking reality,
Yes.
or
Yeah, there were
really
no
so?
dreamlike qualities to it. I've had out of body experiences where symbols also played a part that were shaped a little bit different than that one.
Sure.
But in this one, it was very consistent and stable.
Yeah, that is just, I mean, it blows my mind, that we are capable of such abilities. I mean, as you mentioned, if we tap into our actual powers as is conscious beings, I mean, there's very little external technology that's even required, given we can really communicate pretty much instantaneously with each other. Uh, that's a fascinating experience. You also mentioned that your father had psychic abilities. It's so I'm sure it must have been very reassuring to know that there was a parent that also experienced a lot of what you were experiencing, and it wasn't you weren't always doubting yourself or being told,
Mhm.
hey, what you're experiencing is most likely some creaks in an old house, or you probably just were tired and saw something that looked like a man
Mhm.
walking along, when
Mhm.
in reality clearly was some sort of presence there. And
Mhm.
so how much of a role did that play? It seemed like it played a big role. What were some of his experiences, and how did you guys help each other kind of grow?
That's a great question. And contrary to expectations, my father did not believe in life after death. He believed that when we leave our body, this body no longer functions, we go completely back into the life force consciousness, or whatever, however we want to language that. So I don't believe I ever talked to him about such things, when I would see entities, because he would be a little bit condescending to me about it. It's like, yes, dear.
Interesting.
So he didn't never validated those kinds of experiences for me.
Wow. But how you so even with the abilities that he had himself, so he sort of doubting himself and trying to quote unquote rationalize what it was that he was experiencing through, I guess, um, left brain thinking.
Everyone develops a worldview in some way.
Sure.
And, we might accept one that we've been given. We might question that. We might develop one for ourselves. And as he was as very attracted to Eastern philosophy, to understand some of his experiences, which included claircognizance in a very dramatic way, where he was, I'll tell this little story. He um, had an illumination experience, and that brought his awareness to a level where he could do a little bit of hands-on healing. If you have a headache, he had insight into people's feelings and thoughts, and he wanted to connect with someone who would be able to understand him, to have shared some of his experiences. I could support him to some degree and hold what he was going through. And he wanted someone with his shared experience. So we lived in the East Coast at the time, and he had come out to California, where he knew of a man, and he knew approximately the part of the city that he lived in. And so he parked his car in that area where he knew he lived, and he followed his intuition to find his home. and communicate briefly with him, where I think the gentleman he contacted was, why is, he's coming walking up to my house and wanting to talk to me. It's not a good time. We'll talk another time. But, he followed his knowing to find him. So he was going through something very dramatic for himself. And so that possibility, had always been there for me, of this kind of greater clarity and knowing in ways that don't come through our ordinary sensory experience and thoughts, that process that.
And just want to go back to some of your experiences with uh, out of body experiences in particular, actually. So you mentioned you were able to physically travel, or at least perceive what was going on 3,000 miles away. Have you tried that since? Have you been able to kind of fine tune your abilities in that sense? And what have your experiences been like since that time?
Great question. And to clarify, one of the things that can distinguish an out of body experience from a clairvoyant experience is that there really is a sense of being there. Now, as I've kind of reflected on things over time, the topic of what does it mean to be somewhere has evolved considerably. Um,
Interesting.
uh, but there was definitely that sense of being focused and present in that space rather than seeing it from a distance. And, if you're interested, we can talk about what it means to be located anywhere in psychic space as a
I would love
whole
that,
topic.
actually. That yeah.
So,
Please get yeah, because there's so many things that you hear about as far as where where we are, whether we are physically located anywhere or if we are really everywhere at the same time. And if
yes,
so, really it's a question of, as you mentioned, focusing in on that one location,
yes,
but also being able to have the discernment to understand what you're doing consciously and to be able to interpret that information. And
yes.
and I'm so curious as to what your thoughts are. Please, yes, dive as deeply as you'd like to go into this.
Oh, so with respect to location,
Yes.
one of the things that seemed clear, because in writing my doctoral dissertation, I my question was, what is the nature of reality in that these events can take place? That would make it natural and normal. So I don't think that there's a natural and a supernatural. I think all of this is natural. It's just that we've come in the modern age and in the West to think about things in a very narrow way. Our ways of knowing have become limited to sensory experience and rational reflections on that experience. And with intentionality, all of the psychic experiences and innate knowing have been left off for two reasons. One is that there had been a philosophical evolution towards spiritual dualism for quite some time, at least beginning in the Iron Age, if not a little bit earlier. And so there's this idea that the spirit was another realm and that physical reality was more purely material and wasn't filled with spirit. That's, by the way, that's in complete contradiction to the apparent view of most of humanity up until that time. Humanity's been on this planet for at least 300,000 years. And when we look at the evidence of the Paleolithic, if you look at Neolithic spirituality, you see this sense of reverence for spirit within nature, for this world as a organic, sacred whole, and the sense of connection to plants and to animals. And for, it was a whole different relationship to what we consider masculine and feminine, right? And so there was an evolution, and this is a whole in-depth topic itself, so I hesitate to get down another big one. But to make a long story short, due to particular environmental circumstances and social traumas, a worldview arose that was rather alienated and saw nature as dangerous, that the realm of value was outside of nature, and constructed an idea of a warrior deity in the sky, and had a very negative perspective regarding the earth, which is culminated through male monotheistic religions, where in Christianity, the early church fathers expressed the world as a degraded, um, awful place, and blamed women for even bringing people into it, right? And Christian theologians since then, although many people think of God as being part of the world, the Christian theologians said, no, God is completely outside of this terrible mess, and there's spirit there, but this is degraded. So, gosh, new science, as it arose from this perspective, retained this idea of spirit is out here. And because of the politics with the church, where, if they didn't want to be tortured or burned, they needed to stay out of the church's business. And so they just focused on sensory experience and rationality. So a huge part of natural human ways of knowing were intentionally omitted altogether from our ways of knowing, leading us to this very narrow and limited worldview. So I want to come back to your question. Would you kind of lead us back to that again?
Absolutely, yeah. So the question essentially was on location, where we
Yes,
actually are located.
yes, thank you. So if, the modern view led us to think that somehow consciousness was an epiphenomena of the brain and it's limited here. But when we consult our broader spiritual experiences, and I consulted my own, and I resonated with so many of others that I read about, so I gathered a very large variety. And what became clear is that consciousness is not at all limited to the brain, right? That there's this sense that, part of me could be with my body in California, a part of me could be in this park in New Jersey, and that this isn't unusual, that it seems that where we are is where we're focused. We have this sense of being potentially everywhere. I've come to the conclusion that what we can know is virtually unbounded, except by our own imaginations. So, part of me is with other people that I love who are distant from me. I'm really getting this sense of we're not limited in space, the way we think of in our physical body or in our brain, that we are complexly located according to our attention and our connections, potentially everywhere. And then we're located where we're paying attention, where we have connection. And so it's a very different understanding. This is experiential location is very different.
And I think that that perspective probably allows certain abilities to be used even more effectively just by knowing that, particularly uh, astral projection, for example,
Yes,
in out of body experiences in general. It's just knowing that, hey, you don't have to get outside of this body. You are already
yes,
everywhere, as you mentioned. It's
yes,
just a question of accessing where you want to be.
yes,
And and then it comes back to honing your skills being able to quiet down the mind and really focus in on what it is you're seeking, and that will present itself to you, it seems.
Yes, yes. So we can look at the out of body experience that I described through that perspective and say, part of me was certainly with my body because I was able to be pulled back. There was some knowledge that there was excitement happening. And I was also very focused there, so focused that it seemed that I was there. It felt that I was there. And so there's this sense of being multiply located. And so, and also this focus is so clearly seen as a factor when we look at out of body experiences in general. People describe trying to move like they would in their physical body. First I walked, then I flew, and then they think themselves places, right? There's a bit of a progression in how they understand what it is to travel in psychic space. And it really does come down to that focus on where do you want to go? You focus on that place, and that brings you there. Not because you have to travel, but it brings your attention there.
And it really bypasses that sort of left brain processing that become so accustomed to, and it's almost like this sensation of information that you use to be where you want to be, instead of really just only think it into creation. It's almost like that feeling, the meaning of that location, and then from there, kind of having it in front of you. Can you speak to that?
I think that there's a process that happens. We tend to think of the imagination because if we think about consciousness as limited to the brain, then we think of imagination as some kind of idiosyncratic process that is rather fanciful that takes place within that context. I think of imagination as something more foundational to being. Even if you're looking at a basic single-celled organism that needs to bring in nutrients, for example, that it needs to imagine those nutrients, right? It has the want. It recognizes them, right? It can distinguish them from other things. It can bring them in. Certainly physiologically, imagination is foundational to our functioning as entities. But I think it's also true at the psychic level. And from a psychic level, it's what is it that I want? And then, so we're embodied beings. We might just initially have a thought, gosh, I would like to be in this place that means something to me. And then as we think about that, if we're in alignment with it, there's this other dimension of sometimes we can have a thought and not be all that in alignment with it. If I can quickly use the example of, if you ask most people if they want to be rich, they'll say yes. But do they really? Is all of them really lined up behind wanting that? In many cases, no. I can say for myself, that's not. It would be very convenient, but it's not really what I want. And so if I was focusing on that, I didn't have all of that self aligned behind it, it's not going to go very far. But if what we really want, I really wanted to be in that spot. You might want to be with someone who's dear to you and is at a distance. And then you start to involve a deeper part of your psyche in that imagining. You start to think of them. You may start to feel into them. You can imagine being in their presence. And that imagination can act as a bridge to the actual. And I'm not going to say the imagination is the actual, that there is a kind of a bridge that can happen, particularly under conducive circumstances. I heard this described by a student who was working with shamanic journey experiences, which is a whole nother topic. but that involves active imagination. And I love this point where the student described, I was imagining the bridge, and then I found myself on the real bridge. Imagination can act literally as a bridge to where you want to go, and you can distinguish clearly the difference between what is imagination and what is the event or reality that you're now connected to.
That was actually going to be my next question: is how do you discern between what you're creating in your headspace versus what you're perceiving? I'm, I'm curious.
One thing that I find for myself, and I hear this a bit echoed in other people's experiences, is that there's kind of a signature to experience that tells you something of its origin. For example, when someone thinks of me, I'm particularly aware of strong thoughts or emotional thoughts that someone might think about me, is that, or someone who has passed on, and they're still there, and then there's a presence. There tends to be a signature. It's like, I know who that thought came from, or of course I know who this is. There's something attached to it that indicates the source. And the same is true with imaginary versus real experiences. There is a clear sense of imagination for me attached to that bridge experience, and an absolute knowing that it's actual to the other. And there seems to be this experience itself has some information attached to it.
Absolutely. Wow. I mean, I just find these experiences to really be telling of all the information that's around us that we can perceive, and it just never ceases to amaze me. So that is beautiful that you have been consistently, honing your abilities to be able to share your experiences and hopefully, add to the knowledge of others who are looking to utilize these sorts of abilities responsibly. Um, and I'm just curious as to what your thoughts are of being in your heart space and having the right intention before using such abilities that can really tap into anything or anyone at any point.
Yes, yes. One of the experiences that I've had led me, it was a visionary experience, and it led me to know so deeply within myself that how we treat other people is so foundationally important. And I don't limit that to other human beings. Like our intention and our integrity and our care and our, I will go so far as to say our unconditional love and regard for all beings, and it's challenging in this physical world to always hold that under all circumstances. But that is far more meaningful than words can convey. And that, and it really even goes back to the sense of somebody's throwing hate at you, that you don't throw hate back, but you have compassion for a person who is in such emotional dysregulation that their sense of relief comes from projecting badly onto others. So that left me with the clarity, and in my communications with entities who are for the highest good, they have really emphasized that, the importance of ethics. And so that includes being respectful of other people's privacy. That includes asking for permission. Um, for example, healing. Many people have the capacity to support healing in another person. But we don't know what that person's intention is for that moment or for their life experience. So if we think we know better than they do at some level, which it's easy to do, when you see someone who particularly is acting out, is self-destructive, it's like, whoa, clearly I know better. Let me do for this person. And I'm not saying we should never intervene, but especially when it comes to spiritual intervention, it's like at some level to get permission from them, even if it's not their conscious spoken level, but some deep higher part of them to give permission for healing. The way that these are not abilities that should be misused, because we are ultimately only hurting ourselves if we misuse them. But if we are using them with the intention for the highest good and are being respectful of other people and asking permission, psychically can work in certain circumstances, then you are less likely to cause yourself and others harm. And that's very important.
Absolutely, and it's beautifully put. And thank you for that, because I think it's so important nowadays, especially with all this information available on social media platforms when it comes to manifesting and using our intuition to read uh, others, as well as gather as much information from around us as possible. Sometimes I'm sure that compulsion is there to exercise that power. And so one of the main messages of this show is to promote wisdom first and foremost, and then from there look into what is possible
Yes.
from a human being and from a consciousness perspective. So I really appreciate you shedding light on that. I think that's phenomenal. It's a phenomenal approach and a wonderful way of looking at things. So I just wanted to ask you, about feminine energy, because there's been so much, I think, confusion around what it means to be in touch with our feminine energy. I would love for you to go over what feminine energy means to you and its significance.
Hmm. You know, feminine energy has a particular meaning in this culture, in Western culture in general. We are the inheritors of a particular cultural pattern. And that cultural pattern has um, kind of a dualistic perspective, and it really contrasts masculine and feminine. And it has tended to associate, and I would love to go into the historical reasons why, it's tended to associate men with spirit, intellect, and rationality. And it's tended to associate women um, with body, materiality, emotion, and intuition. Beyond that, for these historical reasons, um, men have been enculturated to lean more towards transcendence, kind of leaving the body forms of spirituality and diminishing what the body actually is and what nature is and what the earth is. And women have had a little bit more of this bias towards leaning towards seeing the sacredness in nature and the body as a site, and even sexuality as a site of spiritual experience. So we've kind of developed this cultural pattern. So according to this cultural pattern, and you even see it, somewhat in the metaphysical conversations that people have. So when historically, the way of viewing the world shifted to this more transcendental view where spirit is outside of the material world. You see this in Greek thought, which was also, very male-dominated culture, where the ideal realm of forms was outside and the material world was that imperfect, more fallen view. You see it, that continuing on and manifest in Christianity and so on. So what that's meant, as we have a religious complex that has spirit as outside and has the word and rationality as dominant in spirituality, the feminine has been what's held more of the intuitive and what one might even call psychic, because, as part of this cultural shift, we had things like the Inquisition in Europe, where if you were not having an experience that fit a very particular profile and it was approved by the church, you were accused of witchcraft and were tortured and burned to death. So there's been a tremendous cultural suppression, right, where the church considered it demonic. The science, which ruled out all of that psychic and spiritual experience as input to their models, considered it to be imaginary at best or delusional. And so these experiences have been very suppressed. And so they've been held in the feminine largely. That doesn't mean that men don't have these experiences. They might be, in certain circumstances, less willing to talk about them because it can conflict with the idea of what a man is supposed to be in this particular cultural pattern. But this intuitive part that we say, oh, it's women's intuition, or we poo-poo it, or, women are not very clear thinkers after all, right? From that point of view, is really the gateway to everything. It is the rest of human experience. And I would say it's far larger than ordinary sensory experience. It's a foundational human way of knowing that has been removed substantially from so many of us, over the course of literally thousands of years of human history. But it's there. It remains there. It's part of women. It's part of men. But women have been more the cultural holders of that.
Absolutely. That's a wonderful way of putting things into perspective. And I find it so important to just share the fact that it's incredibly foundational to have that harmony between feminine energy and masculine energy, and that we all, as you mentioned, have both.
Yes.
Gender might be biological, but when it comes to this energy, it's inherent in all of us. And as you mentioned, this feminine energy allows us to see the world and take it in for what it is. And that's, I think, incredibly, important is an understatement, because it's a way to understand, it's a way to know, and knowing is what leads one to make the decisions necessary for collective growth and personal growth. And so it's almost like if you're ignoring that feminine energy and that intuitive side of you, you're ignoring a majority of existence, and you're not taking in all the information that you need to be able to use your masculine side in a productive, non-toxic way.
Yes.
And I'm curious, I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I wholly agree with you. First, you don't need to think very long and hard to notice that, we all have intellect, we all have bodies, we all have this, potential for spiritual connection. We all have emotions. And we couldn't function as human beings without it. So there's been a kind of a mythology that's been created around this. And I wholly agree. I have come through my research and reflections to see psychic ways of perceiving as the most foundational ways of perceiving. Our ordinary sensory experience is highly processed experience. Our visual experience is, we don't see things like the way that we see things isn't precisely as they are. They're an appearance of how things are to us in our physical mode as human. But, it's originally light touching a cell, right? And then, there's a passing along of information, there's a processing of information until it presents itself as it appears to us. But psychic knowing is more direct. It's not highly processed. And so I think it gets more to the heart of things in themselves. And it doesn't mean that there's just one way that's right to see things in themselves. There's many ways, but it opens up all of those doors.
It's a wonderful way of putting it. And I tend to use the example of being able to really see one's perspective for what it is, or at least as close to what it is as possible, so that we understand just what you said, is there is no one reality. We all have experiences and they're all valid. And once we tune into this intuition, this feminine energy, we can tap into it and therefore make the best possible decisions for that particular situation, for that particular perspective. And that's essentially what leads us to growth and to further our expansion, right, of knowing. And I think it's absolutely wonderful that at this point there is an interest in feminine energy and the significance of it. So wonderful to see folks like yourself really spreading the knowledge and also really kind of addressing some of the misconceptions about what feminine energy truly is and what it means to be in touch with your feminine energy. And now I just want to kind of look in the other direction, and I wanted to get your take on what is toxic feminine energy, and how can you transform that into divine feminine energy?
That's a very interesting question. I think that we can start with the question of what is toxic, period. And what I notice is that what is toxic is what causes injury, and what takes us further away from ourselves, and that breaks our relationships to the whole, to ourselves, to what is. And we are currently in an age of a great deal of trauma. And trauma is famous for creating this rupture in relationship between people and with ourselves. And so a toxic feminine energy would be any, what's masculine and what's feminine energy. It would be what causes harm or injury to another through causing them to devalue themselves, of breaking their relationship between them and trust, in the whole of which they're a part. And
it seems like we're getting back to the foundational aspects of being, where you want to have that intent in order first before tapping into any of these energies. So I suppose it's not necessarily the energy that is toxic, but the intent that could be so.
Yes.
And wow. So no, I really appreciate you shedding light on that. And I suppose similarly, what we're seeing over here, particularly out in the West for a while now, is that intent kind of being used in that what we call quote unquote toxic manner,
Yes.
with masculine energy, which is more of the doing, the taking, or the action, and I suppose the rigid methodologies of doing so. And we're seeing that imbalance in front of us, but at the same time, we now have an awareness that it is there. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that is the number one thing, I think, or at least the first step towards addressing, that
Mm-hmm.
issue is just accepting that it's there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to distinguish between women and men, or people of any gender, however we want to, that, we are not inherently toxic beings. And that we have been part of cultural patterns that have separated us from our broader ways of knowing through our connection to the sacred world around us, causing us to be in denial and suppression of that, to somehow want to be outside of it. There's a lot of ways in which ruptures have occurred. Historically, it has not always been this way. And culturally, men and women have had different roles in this pattern. But there's no inherent toxicity in either sex or in any gender. And my wish is that in this time, we just become more aware of the factors that have shaped us and learn how to heal and repair the ruptures that have occurred so that we can live in greater happiness and harmony and reduce so much unnecessary suffering that is taking place now because of this pattern.
Beautifully put. And I think you hit a great point when you said no one is inherently toxic. It's really just a question of being in our heart space and really understanding what we truly are. And upon doing that, we can lead ourselves in the right direction, look in the right direction, and use both these feminine and masculine energies towards the greater evolution and knowing, and really add to our journeys. So, Lisa, we're running a little short on time. I could continue to talk to you for hours. Been having a phenomenal time, but because we're kind of running down, as far as time is concerned, I would love for you to share where people can learn more about your work and your future plans.
Oh, thank you. Anyone who's interested in some of the ideas that we've discussed today can connect with me via my website, which is Lisa M. Christie. It's just the same as my name.com. And I also am on X, formerly known as Twitter, at Lisa Christie, PhD. And I'd love to connect with people there, and I'd be happy to continue the conversation.
And thank you so much for sharing that, Lisa. Please check out her website. Also, check out her X profile. She has some wonderful insights directly shared on her profile. I've been blown away by so many of her wonderful posts, and I feel like it's an opportunity really to learn from someone who has dove in really deeply and with discernment as well. Lisa, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your profound insights and expertise. Your work is inspiring to say the least, and I deeply appreciate the knowledge and the wisdom that you've imparted along your journey. Your dedication to helping others connect with the sacredness of the natural world and live in harmony is incredibly admirable. And I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for being who you choose to be.
Thank you, Stu. It's been a real pleasure connecting with you. I've enjoyed the conversation.
Me as well. And I very much look forward to having you on again. I feel like, I could have continued this conversation up until, midnight hour. So,
Yeah, I would love that. I enjoyed it.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Lisa. Take care and look forward to seeing you again.
Okay, thank you.